Hi everyone. Can you guys hear me in the back? Okay. My name is Rory Landisman. I am the president of Mustangs United for Israel, and we are the pro-Israel, pro-coalition, pro-peace coalition, here on campus. We hold events like these almost on a monthly basis. We're so honored to be able to bring Arya here and partner with Hillel for this program. Without further ado, Arya Green is a Chief Strategic Officer at Gigawatt Global, an Israeli company developing renewable energy projects in Africa. He's also Director Emeritus of Media Central, a Jerusalem-based project of honest reporting, providing services for the foreign media in Israel, which he co-founded and ran for over a decade. He is the author of the recently published book, My Israel Trail, Finding Peace in Promised Land, about his hike on the 700-mile Israel National Trail. Arya was born in Washington, D.C., a descendant of one of the first Jewish families in North America who arrived in 1690. He grew up in San Francisco, went to UC Berkeley, and has lived in Israel for well over 30 years. Arya has been a policy advisor to Natan Sharansky and a business executive and consultant for the past 3 decades. He served as a senior member of Minister Sharansky's staff in the Israeli Prime Minister's office, where among other things he was responsible for meeting with and supporting civil society activists in the Palestinian Authority and wider Arab and Muslim world. He continues to be active in the effort to promote freedom and democracy in the Middle East. He holds a bachelor's in psychology from UC Berkeley, a master's in international relations from Hebrew University, and a master's in business management from Boston University and Ben-Gurion University, and has been widely published in various newspaper, magazines, and academic publications. Arya was married 3 years ago to Miriam, and they lived in Beit Shemesh, the house of the rising sun. They have 9 children between them, and aside from hiking all over Israel, we're now promoting renewable energy and accuracy in the media. Arya grows grapes and makes wine. Thank you everyone for coming out. Please give a round of applause to Arya Green.
That was way too long, but thank you, Rory. Okay. I'm presuming that if I speak in a normal voice, you can hear me. Tell me if in the back that you can't. And first of all, thank you very much, all of you, for coming out tonight. I'm aware that in the middle of the week, especially a few days before Halloween, there may be other things on your mind, let alone, of course, most of us, or many of us, have family or friends or other contexts here in California who are being very much involved in or affected by the fires in the south and the north, and I certainly wish success and health and safety to all of those who are affected, and thank you for taking the time to come out tonight to speak about such a very, very important issue, I think, for so many of us, irrespective of our background, because we as Americans and you as students and people active in a college campus, in an academic environment, interested in studying issues related to freedom and human rights and democracy, and especially, it doesn't matter whether our background is as Christians or Jews or Muslims or foreign students or Americans. These are issues which I think affect all of us, and I appreciate your taking the time and having the interest in talking about human rights and freedom in the Middle East. I'd like to put our discussion, and it will be a discussion, as Jake mentioned. I'll speak for 30, perhaps maximum 40 minutes. I hope to offer some provocative perspectives on the issues that we're addressing tonight, but then I want to open for real discussion. I want to open the rest of the evening to your comments, your questions, and even your arguments. You're welcome to disagree with me. In fact, I would welcome that, because those kind of challenges are important for all of us. I want to put the discussion about freedom, democracy, and human rights in the Middle East into a bit of context. On the drive down here, my wife and I drove from San Rafael down the coastal road, and of course that was a beautiful mini vacation for 6 or 8 hours as we drove, and we stopped at the beach just north of here where the sea lions congregate. What's it called? Morro Bay. And we were walking we stopped, we parked, we started to walk, and we noticed we couldn't walk wherever we wanted to. There's a restriction there on our freedom of movement. We couldn't just go down to the beach. We couldn't just walk along to see where we want. We had to follow a certain framework that had been set out by the authorities. Now, on the one hand, one could say, hey, hold on a second. It's a free country. It's a public beach. I should be able to go where I want. But on the other hand, we recognize that there are values in our society as a democracy, which in order to preserve and protect those values, enables the government, encourages, empowers the government to restrict some of our freedoms in the name of another value. In this case, the preservation of the natural habitat of the sea lions. So while we felt it was unfairly restrictive of us, we recognized that there was a value to preserving that natural habitat, and so we respected that. Had we not respected that, I suppose a forest ranger or a highway patrolman or somebody would have come, or a good citizen would have come and arrested us or at least castigated us. Why am I mentioning that? Because any discussion of democracy, freedom, and human rights has to be held in a context which reflects the reality of the modern world that we live in. Because human rights and democracy and freedom don't exist in a vacuum. So let me put it in a different context. Imagine for a minute, I'm walking along the side of a cliff on a trail about this wide. I don't have to exaggerate, about this wide. And on my left of this is a cliff going up, and on my right is a fall down a good 40 feet to boulders below. And I'm hiking all alone with a 50-pound pack on my back. And I come to a point at the edge of this cliff where the trail just stops. And I panicked. This is a true story. I relate it in my book about my hike on the Israel Trail. And I panicked because I froze. I didn't know what to do. So, any of you read the book by Thomas Crum, 3 Deep Breaths? Wonderful book. I recommend it to all of you. Short book, hour-and-a-half read. Gives you a very, very good perspective on stressful situations. I took 3 deep breaths to calm myself down and center myself and to think about what am I supposed to do here. And I slowly let my pack fall to the ground, turned around and gingerly followed the path back to where I realized, okay, I missed where the trail was supposed to go. And I got back to my pack then and put it on, and it was strange because somehow it felt lighter, which didn't make any sense. It's not like anybody took anything out of my pack, but what had changed was I had a better sense of where I was going. I had a better understanding of the path that I was meant to take. And the reason I'm sharing this particular anecdote from the hike itself with you is that sometimes, I learned that day, sometimes we have to set aside our baggage. Sometimes we have to put our pack down in order to recognize what is the path that we need to walk, or especially intellectually, what is the direction that we need to let our thoughts flow in. And what I'd like to do tonight is to put all of our baggage aside. It doesn't matter to me, to any of us tonight, whether you call yourself pro-Israel or pro-Palestinian, whether you call yourself pro-gay rights or anti-abortion. It doesn't matter what your perspective is on the Arab-Israel conflict. What matters is a robust intellectual discussion and understanding of what we mean when we talk about human rights and freedom and democracy, in order to enable us to then evaluate what's really going on in the world around us. Where do our values lie, and where do they direct us in terms of our understanding of policy prescriptions for specific conflict areas, whether it's the Arab-Israel conflict or other issues, and what policies our government ought to pursue here in America, not least in the midst of an election season that we're coming up to in the middle of next year. Let's take a moment for one other contextual framework before I enter into a more detailed analysis. How many of you are from this area of San Luis Obispo? Okay, very few. How many of you are from, let's say, how many of you took a plane an airplane in order to arrive here for the school year? A good half of you at least, okay? And let's make it easier. How many of you have gotten on a plane in the last year? Yeah, that's what I thought. When we go to check into our flight and we walk through a security barrier and we're asked questions, who packed your bag? Was your bag with you the whole time? Where are you traveling? What's the purpose of your travel? We today, in 2019, no longer resent those questions. But I'll tell you a funny story. About 15 years ago, when I was at a check-in counter in Columbus, Ohio, where there was a fellow next to me checking in, and good for her, the woman who was checking him in was patient and civil and polite. He was getting very hot under the collar because she was asking him, who packed your bags? What's the purpose of your visit? Where are you going today? And he was saying, I just want to get on the plane. Why are you asking me all these questions? And she said to him, sir, you do not have to answer any of these questions if you don't want to. You can take a train, you can drive, you can take a bus, you can walk, you don't have to travel. But our regulations now, this was 15 years ago or so, you can imagine the environment we're talking about. Our regulations now require me to ask you these questions for security purposes, because our goal is to preserve and protect the safety of all of our passengers. And I was just a witness to the side of this conversation, but I found it a fascinating example of the fact that today, all of you who raised your hands, who went on an airplane in the last year, recognize that although there's an incredible violation of our right to privacy in the asking of those sorts of questions, a violation to a certain extent of our freedom of movement by requiring us to go through a screening process and an x-ray or a metal detector before we get on a plane, a violation of our freedoms, fundamental freedoms in our country. We no longer resent them. We no longer even wonder why they are in place, because we recognize that there's a balance. Our balance, we recognize that there's a balance between our right to privacy, our right to freedom of movement in our own society. I'm talking here about domestic travel. I'm not talking about getting on a plane to Mexico or Colombia or France. But those rights to privacy and to freedom of movement are balanced by what? Our fundamental right to life. Meaning, the protection that's afforded by the government for public safety is actually not a rubric which is an intellectual exercise or a part of modern governance. It's actually a protection of a value that we hold dear as a society, our right to life. And our right to life trumps, in this case, I'm sorry to use a slightly politicized word these days. I've lived in Israel for 35 years, and therefore my vocabulary in English sometimes doesn't keep up with modern sensibilities. But our right to life supersedes our right to privacy today. None of us question that. So why am I saying this? You know, in America today, there are cities, Chicago, many others, where if you are under 18, you're not allowed on the street after 11 at night. That's a fundamental violation of our freedoms, isn't it, as a society? And yet, we have a societal structure that recognizes that even though we have a right of freedom of movement, again, this is an example of restricting that right. What's the point that I'm making? We here, on college campuses in particular, but in the wider elements of society, and not least in an election campaign, certainly here in America, but more and more so in Europe, a parroting of a particular train of thought which has found its way into the highest levels of diplomacy in Europe, as well as in the United Nations, accusing Israel of being the grossest violator of human rights on the planet. The United Nations Human Rights Council passes more resolutions against Israel than all other nations combined. I want you to think about that for a second. that Venezuela, which was just elected to a position in the Human Rights Council, that Syria, China, Burma, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, the most brutal dictatorships in the world, Mozambique or other nations like Malawi with thousands of slaves in their society. We're talking about societies and cultures and political entities which are totalitarian dictatorships, where imprisonment of dissenters, where brutalizing or raping of women, female genital mutilation, the cutting off of hands of thieves are common practice. And yet the United Nations Human Rights Council feels that Israel, in, let's say, for instance, allowing a Jewish community in the disputed territories to have another building built, is a more important focus of discussion and condemnation by the United Nations Human Rights Council than 500,000 people killed in Syria by the Assad regime and ISIS over the last 7 years. What I want to challenge us today is a discussion of how we define human rights and freedom, and to allow us to include that definition in any discussion that we're going to have about Israel, the Arab-Israel conflict, so that at least our discussion is based on both facts and a consistent understanding of our value system and these definitions. I'm going to pause for a second and make something very, very clear. I worked for one of the most amazing leaders of the international human rights movement for over a decade. Natan Sharansky was imprisoned in the Soviet Gulag as one of the leaders of the Soviet Union human rights movement for 9 years, including 2 years in total of solitary confinement. When he came to Israel, he continued to be a champion of human rights. And the privilege I had of working with him also enabled me to understand what it is that we mean when we have these public discussions. But Mr. Sharansky always used to say, he was an Israeli politician, and as Rohi mentioned, he was deputy prime minister, and I worked with him in the prime minister's office. Mr. Sharansky always used to say, not only is criticism of Israeli policy perfectly reasonable, in other words, we're not here to not have a conversation about reasonable and legitimate criticism of Israeli policy where reasonable people can debate issues. He used to say, not only is criticism of Israeli policy reasonable, you cannot be a successful politician in Israel if you don't criticize the government's policy. I want you to understand that whatever we talk about today about Israel, the Arab-Israel conflict, the Palestinians, the wider Arab or Muslim world, is nothing, it is not in any way suggesting that Israel's always right, or that it's not reasonable, or that reasonable people can't disagree about Israeli policy. What it is, though, demanding is that we can be consistent in our understanding of what our values are and what are our goals for Israel, for those who self-identify in the Arab world as Palestinian, for the wider Arab world and the wider Muslim world, and in fact for humanity together. So let's agree on one basis for this discussion. We sit here in America. I haven't asked you, as students or members of the community here in San Luis Obispo and students at Cal Poly, I haven't asked you, are you right-wing or left-wing? I don't even know if you're American citizens or foreign students. I don't know if you're Christian or Jewish or Muslim or atheist or anything else under the sun. But I'm going to assume the following. I'm going to assume that we all share a belief in the fundamental right of all human beings to believe what they want to believe. Freedom of thought. I'm going to assume that we share, because we're here in the United States of America, which shares a certain Western tradition of thought and philosophy and law with Europe and Israel and other countries like Japan, that Every individual in our society is free to express their beliefs if they would like to. Freedom of thought and freedom of expression are two basic tenets of our societies. And freedom of speech leads to freedom of the press, which we hold dear. That a vigorous press, a vigorous journalist community, the fourth arm, as it were, of our society, keeping our government and our society honest, as it were, is an integral part of our value system. I'm going to assume further that we'll agree that freedom of religion is part of that original freedom of conscience, freedom of thought that I was expressing. I'm going to go one step further. This is a little bit more controversial, but I'm going to guess we're all going to agree that one of the important issues we as a society like to promote and feel is important to promote is women's rights. The right of a woman to equal pay, to control her own body, to decide who she wants to marry, to walk in the street without being harassed physically, verbally, or otherwise. So I'm going to assume that women's rights are something that we hold dear. I'm going to go one step further. Not only because I was raised in San Francisco and we're here in California, but in general, modern American society, here I'm getting a little bit more controversial, but I think I'm still on pretty reasonable ground, that we'll agree that gay rights are important for modern society. I'm assuming you can see where I'm leading here. If gay rights, women's rights, freedom of religion, freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of our conscience, are things that we agree are the fundamental rights, the fundamental human and civil and political rights that we hold dear, we ought to be supporting those rights. We ought to be agitating for those rights to be respected by all societies throughout humanity. And in this case, I'm referring to all societies, however traditional, however perhaps hierarchical. Not necessarily Western societies, but we've seen, by the way, in Japan, just as one example, there are others, like Azerbaijan and others in more modern times, but after World War II, we saw a transformation of Japanese society into a Western democratic society protecting the civil and political and human rights of its people, although its culture remained Eastern, somewhat hierarchical, traditional. And we've seen with an example like Azerbaijan, just as one example, a Muslim society, traditional, can also be one which protects and promotes these fundamental rights of what we consider to be democracy, our freedom of conscience and religion and speech, as well as women's rights and others. Now we can understand, if we're going to have a conversation about human rights and freedom and democracy in the Middle East, where that conversation needs to start. And here I'm going to be a little bit more, I think, provocative. I gave a talk once in San Francisco State University, where I was there to talk specifically about the Arab-Israel conflict, and I was specifically there to speak about Israel and our society in Israel. And there's no secret here. Roe introduced me as somebody who's lived in Israel for 35 years. It's not only that I wear one of these, I happen to be an Israeli citizen, and I've lived there for over 3 decades, proudly as a citizen of the United States who's retained my citizenship here, as a descendant of one of the first families to have come to the United States, as Roy mentioned, in 1690, and also as a proud Israeli and a member of the Jewish people who've returned to our ancestral homeland there in the land of Israel. I was speaking there from a perspective about Israel in front of a sign that said, "Free Palestine." And I was so excited and enthusiastic that that sign was there. The people who put it up thought that they were arguing with me. They thought that they were heckling me, that they were opposing the presentation I was going to give about Israel. And what I pointed out then, which I'm pointing out now, is that I think you would be hard-pressed to find another person in Israel or America, in academia or in public life, who is more pro-Palestinian than I am. And I say that unreservedly, because I've spent most of the last 35 years both working with Palestinian human rights and civil society activists and leaders, as well as those from the wider Arab world, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, Jordan, and others, in order to promote a Palestinian and wider Arab and Muslim society which reflects those values that we just discussed. Freedom of religion, freedom of expression, women's rights, gay rights, or what have you. I am somebody who has advocated, and I mean publicly, I don't mean only in quiet back channel discussions which I've been involved with Palestinian former cabinet ministers and civil society leaders, academics, and others, but I mean in public, in op-eds and in public discussions like these. I've been somebody who has advocated the concept of an independent Palestinian state, wherever its borders might be established, depending on a real peace engagement process and real peace agreement with the nation state of the Jewish people, Israel. I'm somebody who has been an avid advocate of a growing movement towards freedom within Palestinian society. And this is where these discussions become a little bit sensitive. If you care about Palestinians, if you care about the Arab world in general, if you care about the wider Muslim world, or other societies on this planet, which are ruled by dictatorial, totalitarian regimes who oppress and suppress their people, regimes like Saudi Arabia, in which a Christian community is not allowed to worship even in a private home, regimes like the Palestinian Authority who imprison people who criticize Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, on a Facebook post. Regimes like China, which has more journalists in prison than any other nation on the planet. If you care about promoting these societies and benefiting the people who live there, then you'll agree with my friend Mohammed Dajani, a Palestinian Arab Muslim who leads a project, fascinating project called Wasatiyah, which in Arabic means the middle way, a moderate, centrist path from an Islamic standpoint, not an atheist or agnostic or non-religious standpoint, but based on Quranic sources, where Mohammed Dajani has stood with me in rooms like this, in having discussions with people like yourselves and students like yourselves, and has said that he recognizes the legitimacy of the Jews' connection, the people of Israel's connection to the land of Israel, and the legitimacy of the establishment of the nation state of the people of Israel, the nation state of Israel in modern times. That he recognizes that legitimacy, but at the same time wants to build an independent Palestine in whatever borders are agreed with that Jewish state of Israel. And that what he wants more than anything else is a Palestinian society which reflects the values that we were just discussing earlier. Not just those freedoms, women's empowerment, freedom of speech, etc., but also the openness and tolerance and coexistence which is reflected in the best of the Quranic and Islamic tradition vis-a-vis other Muslims, vis-a-vis the Jews, vis-a-vis Christians with a history of 1,000 years and more in the region. A Muhammad Dajani, or a Walid Salem, or a Hana Senora, are people, or Rami Nasrallah, these are names of real people who are civil society activists and leaders in Palestinian and Arab and Muslim society, who agree fundamentally with the principles I'm sharing with you today. I want our discussion to be one that's based on a shared understanding that whatever criticism we have of Israel's defensive military operations, whatever criticism we have of Israel's building in Jewish communities in those disputed territories of Judea and Samaria, widely known as the West Bank of the Jordan River, whatever one feels about Israel's military operations against terrorists within those territories, whatever one feels about internal Israel issues vis-a-vis our 20% of our society who are Arab, mostly Muslim citizens of Israel, where there is some discrimination to be dealt with. By the way, no more than there is against African Americans in America, or Pakistanis in Britain, or Algerians in France, or Turks in Germany. All of us democracies have a bit of a challenge of dealing with some of the minorities in our midst, and Israel has that challenge with our Arab Israeli citizens, and yet point I'm making is with all of the discussions we might have of those Israeli policies and others in terms of domestic Israeli issues or Israel's foreign relations, we have to keep in context and in our understanding the basis for our discussions, which means something very simple. When I have a conversation, or if I go on television and have an interview, or if I have a discussion, a roundtable with professors of international relations or human rights programs leaders and what have you, and they start using terms like Israel's a colonialist, imperialist outpost of Europe, which is laughable since most of Israel's population actually come from Arab countries and are not necessarily European or Ashkenazi as we describe them in our Jewish community. Or when they start talking about how Israel's establishment was a result of the Holocaust, as if the Zionist movement didn't precede the Holocaust for almost 100 years, as if the entire framework of Jewish philosophy and identity as a civilization, as a culture, as a people, didn't predate the Holocaust by 2,000, 3,000 years, as if the connection between the Jewish people and Zion, Jerusalem, didn't exist, in fact, in history for 3,500 years. When people start talking about Israel as the grossest violator of human rights in the world without understanding the context where real gross violations of human rights occur every day and are either not reported in the media or not considered sufficiently important for the international community to discuss in the Security Council, or because of political realities where nobody wants to get on the bad side of China or Saudi Arabia or, in fact, Iran, those countries are not roundly condemned by the Human Rights Council, that body that was set up specifically to monitor, to critique, and to call to order the human rights violators of the planet. That's when I insist that we halt the discussion, contextualize it, and then, using rhetoric which is appropriate for a reasonable discussion of Israeli policy, Jordanian policy, Saudi Arabian, Lebanese, Iranian, Iraqi, Egyptian, or others, have a discussion about what we need to do to promote real human rights and freedom and democracy in the Middle East. I'm going to stop there because I think I've thrown out enough provocative ideas, or I hope I have, to engender a bit of a discussion. I'm certainly happy to go into detail of any of the concepts that I've introduced here. I am very happy to share with you concrete examples, whether from history or law, of some of the ideas that I've shared with you this evening. And I'm more than happy to address your concerns, or if you have an argument to make that you would like me to, that you'd like to make against something that I've said. I want to open it to you to ask questions, or to raise your own concerns, or to direct this discussion in a direction that you'd like. So please, thank you very much for your interest. Your questions. We'll start here, but I'll go around the room. And considering that we talked about rights and freedoms, I would like to see, I just saw 4 male hands raised. So I want some of you to think in terms of women's empowerment. I'd like the third question at least to be from a woman. Yes, go ahead. Your name and where you're from.
My name is Oren, born in Petah Tikva, but from the Bay Area. And I just was wondering for your take on, so I feel like it's pretty fair to say that there's a lot of political deadlock in Israel, especially recently. And I was just wondering what you think about whether or not constant political deadlock like that has any contribution to an inability to create kind of a positive path forward among, like, and create this discussion worldwide about these issues.
You know, it's an interesting question. The question was whether or not the internal political issues in Israel were now, after our second election in 1 year, and we're still not sure whether or not there's going to be a formation of the government. It's a different kind of a system than we have here in America. There's a parliamentary system where you have to form a governing coalition. It's a bit complex. The question was whether or not those internal conflicts or the inability to have a reasonable government and structure, whether that affects some of these issues. And my answer to that is fundamentally, forgive me for being argumentative, but it sounds like you're Israeli and we Israelis argue all the time. I would say no. I would say absolutely not. This discussion about human rights and freedom and democracy in the Middle East is one which both is had and must be had completely separate out of any context of any internal Israeli political argument. And there's two reasons I say that. One is conceptually, this is a discussion that we Americans and Europeans, Japanese, and others with a Western democratic tradition need to recognize. We need to take back the banner of human rights. We need to not let a China or an Iran or a Syria pretend that they are somehow promoting rights, because they use that language. Do you remember that was it Germany? Eastern Germany was called the German Democratic Republic. The whole idea of Orwellian, what was it called? Doublespeak. Thank you. Using the terminology of human rights and democracy within the context of an anti-democratic totalitarian society. We in the West, in the free world, need to take back that banner and insist that the real champions of human rights be supported, and that those champions, especially in totalitarian and dictatorial societies, be supported monetarily and publicly, and as well as conceptually. But the other answer would be this. Whatever internal debates we have in Israel, there's no debate about rights. There's no debate about civil rights and political rights. We live in a society where, it's kind of a joke, but it's not. The only Arab society in the Middle East, the only society in the Middle East where an Arab can criticize his or her own government and not be afraid of being beaten up in the street or thrown into prison or worse, the only society where an Arab can criticize their government in the Middle East is where? Israel. In the democratic state of Israel. Which is not a statement about rah-rah Israel, everything it does is wonderful. It's a factual statement about the societies of the Middle East. And our internal debates over pluralism or over economic issues or immigration issues or even about defense issues, even about issues of should we or shouldn't we withdraw from territories or negotiate an agreement with this or that Palestinian or Arab leader, those have nothing to do with rights. The fundamental values of Western society were founded from the Jewish biblical tradition and philosophy. Raise your hand if you're a philosophy student here. This is an academic campus. 1, 2. If you're a student of political science, international relations, you read Rousseau, you read Kant, Thomas Jefferson. These are people who have explicitly acknowledged the debt of Western society and modern democratic theory to biblical concepts of humanity being created in the image of God. From Genesis, the biblical portion, the Torah portion the Jews read every week from this last week, where explicitly it says God created humanity in the image of God. This divine image, by definition within Jewish law and philosophy, is the founding principle of the ideas of equality that led to democracy, or the idea of one person and one vote, that led to the idea of the dignity of the human being, whether in the workplace or in society, that led to the idea of women's rights even in the Talmud, which were then adopted by later Christian philosophers like Augustine and others, and Rousseau and Kant, and as I mentioned, Thomas Jefferson and others explicitly acknowledged that debt to the Hebrew Bible and to Jewish philosophy. And therefore, Israeli society, or in response to your question, there are no internal debates as to whether or not Arabs in Israel should or shouldn't have rights. The left wing and the right wing agree. I mean, we have Arab Supreme Court justices, including one that imprisoned our president. We have Arabs who serve in the Knesset, including those who call for the destruction of the nation-state of the Jewish people as we understand it today. Talk about freedom of expression, or political or civil rights. So no, the internal debates that we have in Israel do not retard the advancement of democracy and freedom in the Middle East. I will say that we could be more strong in Israel and in America and in Europe in promoting the human rights and freedoms that we're discussing today in other societies in the Middle East. But that's maybe a kind of a different way of looking at it. There was a question. Yes, go ahead. I'm going to call on students really first, and then I'll come to community members afterwards. Yes.
If you believe there is such thing, do you believe there is a fine line between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism?
What's your name?
Hayden.
Hayden, where are you from?
Southern California.
Thank you very much for the question, Hayden. There is no fine line between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Let me make this explicitly clear. Once again, we're not talking about the idea that reasonable people can debate every policy issue when it comes to Israeli policy or Arab policy vis-a-vis Israel or any other government policy, including American policy. The difference between reasonable criticism of a government policy and the delegitimization or the demonization of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people is not a fine line. It is explicitly clear. If somebody comes and says Israel has no right to exist, my first question to them is, okay, does Pakistan have a right to exist? Does Bangladesh? Does Jordan? Does Lebanon? Does Syria? If you come to me as an anarchist or as a universal theorist of one world and say to me, I don't believe in any nation states, that's a conversation we can have. If you come to me and say, out of the 70 plus new nations founded and accepted in the post-colonial period after World War II, only one has no right to exist, that's anti-Semitism. Whether we call it anti-Zionism or Israel hatred or discrimination or delegitimization, it doesn't matter what word we use. And the same thing when it comes to demonization, and this is where we come full circle to the United Nations Human Rights Council. If the United Nations Human Rights Council criticized all military defensive operations carried out by governments democratic and non-democratic, which led to civilian casualties, then on that list, Israel would appear somewhere very low on the list for the record, but it would be reasonable for them to condemn Israel's defensive military operations that led to civilian casualties after they had condemned those of, for instance, America and Great Britain in Afghanistan and Iraq. After they had condemned the non-democratic military campaigns throughout the world, and most particularly in the Middle East, where civilian casualties were literally in the millions. Once the United Nations Human Rights Council condemns Iraq and Iran for the million or so people who died in the 10-year Iraq and Iran war, once they condemn Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Iran for the activities going on today there, and or of course Syria and Iraq and ISIS and the others, then we can talk about Israel's defensive military operations. And yes, reasonable people can disagree. Should Israel go into Gaza to stop the incessant rocket fire on Israel's civilian population, which itself is a war crime? Should Israel carry out a defensive military operation, or shouldn't it? Should it go in on the ground or just by the air? Should it have specific military strikes on specific targets, or should it carry out a wider campaign? Reasonable people can disagree about what Israel should do in its defensive military operations. Reasonable people cannot demonize Israel as if they're Nazis, as if they are worse than, or even equivalent to, the barbaric regimes that today carry out not defensive, offensive military operations, killing millions of civilians without condemnation by the United Nations Human Rights Council. So forgive me for being a bit animated, but there is no distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, because anti-Zionism by definition holds Israel to a different standard than that held any other country. And therefore, if you want to criticize Israel and its policies, be my guest, but do so from the standpoint of factual, historical, legal argument, and not the kind of rhetoric that suggests that Israel has no right to exist. Question?
Why don't more American Jews feel empowered to criticize Israel and its policies?
That's a brilliant question. What's your name?
Jake.
Jake from?
Los Angeles.
Los Angeles. Jake asked, why don't more Americans, or did you say Jews?
Americans and American Jews.
Why don't more Americans and American Jews feel empowered to criticize Israeli policy? If this wasn't a serious academic discussion, and I'm not in any way meaning to either embarrass or diss you, Jake, what are you talking about? All we hear, I mean, maybe you meant the question to be this way, somewhat sarcastic, but all we hear today, reading the New York Times or listening to the BBC or NPR or watching CNN or MSNBC, all we hear today is criticism of Israel. We hear comparisons of Bibi Netanyahu to some of the worst leaders in the world. We hear criticism of Israel for not only our defensive military operations, but sometimes our domestic policies, which are internal debates in civil society on religious issues, what have you. There's criticism of Israel from right and from left, all the time, everywhere, and most particularly on college campuses. So I'm going to give you a chance to clarify, what did you mean when you asked the question, why don't Americans or Jews feel comfortable criticizing Israel?
I hear very few, if any, conversations within the Jewish community that I've been exposed to regarding things Israel is doing that are wrong. And I feel like the only one who's comfortable in some of the circles that I am in talking about and being adamant about the things that Israel is doing that I don't really like. And I just don't feel like a lot of people in whatever environment they're in feel confident enough to do the same.
Well, I'm fascinated by that, Jake, and I'd be delighted to have a private conversation with you afterwards. Not private because I don't want to share it with others. I just don't want us to dominate the rest of the discussion with this. But I have two things to say. First of all, I want you to know, as an Israeli, and as an American Jew who grew up in a Reformed Jewish family in San Francisco, and as today an Orthodox Jew who's observant of Jewish tradition, as somebody who considers myself a real centrist in Israeli politics and also American politics, I personally, and I think I speak for the vast majority of the American Jewish and the wider Jewish community, welcome your criticism. I'm astounded and a bit concerned to hear you say that you feel stymied, because all I hear is criticism of Israel. And I think the subtle issue that we're dealing with is one of language. And I'll be explicit. As we speak, the J Street National Convention is being held in Washington, D.C. There, you will hear nothing but criticism of the Israeli government, mostly from the left of the American political spectrum and the Jewish liberal political spectrum, philosophical spectrum. That's what the conference is all about. The raison d'etre, the founding of J Street, was to provide a platform for more vigorous criticism of Israel. Most Reform synagogues, conservative and many Orthodox also, have ongoing dialogues and discussions which include great criticism of Israel. I think what you may have experienced, and I'm just interpolating here, and that's why I said we can talk about this later, relates to my answer to the previous question about the difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, of which I said there's no difference. If by criticism of Israel, you're saying Israel has no right to exist, which I'm assuming that's not what you're saying, but sometimes the rhetoric that we use, like, for instance, let's just take one example. And this is an important example, especially for those of you who are students of political science, or history, international law, international relations, or the like. The term occupation. In a dialogue about Israel's presence in those disputed territories, when one uses the term occupied territories, one already prejudices the conversation to be, by definition, putting Israel in the wrong. When you have a conversation, and perhaps you've had similar conversations, where you talk about, I oppose Israel's occupation, often a response you'll get is, well, you're being anti-Israel, which makes you feel like, well, I can't express my opposition to that presence of Israel in the territories. But this is a subtle but very, very important point, and it's a good example. So it's worth getting into for maybe another minute or two. Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people, as I've described it before. That Jewish people received international approval for the concept of the return of those people to our ancestral homeland, the land of Israel, which ended up leading 50 years later to the establishment of the nation state, the modern nation state of Israel. That international approval was not coming out of nowhere. It was a result of the international acknowledgement by the powers of the late 19th century, the early 20th century, that there was a natural connection between the people of Israel and the land of Israel as the indigenous people of the land. In the end, in international legal instruments, including the mandate given to Great Britain for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, as it was called then, the international agreement was concretizing in legal instruments, which gave that claim of the Jewish people to that land legitimacy in modern international law. When the Arab countries, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt, with other expeditionary forces and irregulars from the local Arab community, attacked the nascent state of Israel at its founding, that was an act of international aggression. Having fought the War of Independence, Israel had armistice lines that were agreed upon in the Rhodes Agreement of 1949. Those of you who have studied these things, who are students of the Middle East, are aware of this, that in the Rhodes Agreement of 1949, those armistice agreements explicitly stated that nothing in those agreements would prejudice any party's claims to any territories that they had a previous claim to. The Jewish people had a claim to all of mandatory Palestine, which for the record included the eastern section of mandatory Palestine, present-day Jordan, but certainly those disputed territories of Judea and Samaria, the highlands to the east of the coastal plain, where Jerusalem is in the center and Samaria in the north and Judea in the south. Don't get disturbed. Judea and Samaria are cartological, historical terms. They're not political. And if you want to be explicit, which I try to be, one can describe these territories as disputed territories. They're territories in dispute. The Jews claim those territories based on law, on international law and history, and the result of defensive military operations in 47 to 49 and 67, having been attacked by their neighboring Arab countries. And the Arab community, those who self-identify as Palestinian, stake a claim to those territories as residents of those territories as well. Those two competing claims need to be adjudicated, need to be negotiated, need to be resolved. When they are resolved, we'll have peace between those who self-identify as Palestinians and Israel. And one would hope, perhaps, at the same time, we would find Arab countries around the region who would accept Israel's right to exist and legitimacy, and we'll have a wider sense of peace. But the term occupation is not a casual term. If you, Jake, Jake, you're sitting in a chair right now. For the sake of this example, let's pretend that these chairs can be, I can see that they're connected to each other, so you can't exactly pick up. But you occupy that chair, don't you? In colloquial usage, that's the way we understand the term occupation. You occupy that chair. Nobody's going to argue with that. But were you to stand up and want to take that chair home, the university authorities would say, wait a second, that's ours, that's not yours. You'd have to have a little bit of a discussion about your occupation of the chair having any real meaning in law or sense of possession. The term occupation is not a colloquial term in international law. The Geneva Convention of 1949 explicitly states that a country that occupies another sovereign state's territory in the act of belligerent warfare is considered an occupier. And that occupier has certain rights, certain obligations, and eventually the conflict has to be resolved in favor of one or another. In this case, there was no legal sovereign in 1949 when the Rhodes Agreement, the Armistice Agreement, was signed. Jordan was an illegal occupier of what is known as, they termed it, the West Bank of the Jordan River, in order to create some new idea that there's an East Bank and a West Bank of that river, and that they had some claim to the West Bank. Please don't get me wrong. Nothing of what I'm saying or am about to say suggests that there shouldn't be a Palestinian state in what they call the West Bank. That is a discussion for those who would like to resolve the political conflict between the Arabs and the Jews, and hopefully, within the context of a real peace agreement between Arabs and Jews, there might be room for another Arab state. one called Palestine perhaps, in some of those territories, all of those territories, other territories, who knows. But the term occupation is explicitly inapplicable to these territories because there was no legal sovereign there, because Israel's presence after 1967 was a result of a defensive military operation which, under the terms of the United Nations Charter, was completely legal. Its possession of the territories is completely legal under international law. Its building of Jewish communities within state lands, not private lands, but state lands, is prima facie legal. You can object to them for political reasons. Again, reasonable people can disagree about policy issues. But calling it an occupation is the example I'm giving to Jake and to all of you, to an understanding of where reasonable criticism of Israel segues into the demonization of Israel. Those territories are in dispute. And because they have been called now for 20, 30 years occupied, because today almost any media article that you read or listen to or watch, almost any academic discussion about those territories talks about Israel's occupation or Israel's settlements, which are illegal under international law. This has just become parroting of anti-Israel rhetoric, which has no basis in law or politics. And the problem then, coming back to your question, Jake, and with this I'll close with this answer, and I'm sorry that it kind of got into a little bit of detail, but I think the example is important. The problem is that when criticizing Israel, if one uses anti-Israel rhetoric, which parrots the rhetoric used by those who wish to see Israel destroyed, then those even who are interested in criticizing Israeli policy but who support Israel's right to exist almost naturally end up pushing back rather than engaging in proper debate. So we can talk also later more about how that debate can be encouraged, but I'm definitely answering your question that I believe that criticism of Israel today throughout American society, and especially in the Jewish community, is rampant and welcome, as evidenced by the J Street Conference being carried on today. Yeah?
My name is Joe, I'm from the Bay Area.
Joe?
Can you talk briefly about your time with Likud and your departure, and then what a peace plan would look like under Likud and under a party led by Gantz?
I got the second part of the question. What was departure?
Or I don't know about departure, but you're not an advisor for Latana anymore?
No.
Yeah, did you just resign?
Oh, I understand. Okay, no, that's the other question. Rohi or Rachel, can I ask for a cup of water or a bottle of water into something? Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. The answer to the second part of the first part of the question, Nathan Sharansky was a minister for many years. He resigned actually under the government of Sharon. I continue to work with him in the party and also in a think tank. And then, as Rohi mentioned, I ended up running a different organization that provided services for the foreign press who were visiting, based in or visiting Israel, and then working for a renewable energy company now that builds solar and wind and other installations throughout Africa, based in Jerusalem. So, but we've remained friends and in contact, including when he was the head of the Jewish Agency for Israel. As to your more basic question, I love questions which are easy. You know, Henry Kissinger once said, he was once asked by one of his advisors as he went out for an interview, asking, you know, are you ready? Are you prepared? And Henry Kissinger said to his advisor, I hope your questions are as good as my answers. Meaning he already knew what he wanted to say, and he was just going to... In this case, the question that you asked, the question was, what are the differences, I think it was your question, between a Likud-led government or a Benny Gantz, this new party called Blue and White in Israel government, in terms of the prospects for peace. And the reason I say it's an easy question is because the answer is much easier than you think. I would challenge any of you, after our discussion, to come up to me and to suggest to me one area, one, of policy where you can prove to me that there's any difference of any real importance between Blue and White, this new party, and the Likud, Netanyahu's party, on policy issues. I've studied this. I've been very, very involved in it over the last few years. Iran, economics, health policy, immigration, vis-a-vis Palestinians in negotiations or withdrawal from territories, the Jordan Valley, security issues, military operations against Gaza. There is nothing, relations with China, Russia, America, India, Brazil, there is nothing of substance to differentiate between those two major parties in Israel. Now, just for a second, I want to share with you, since you asked, and Joe, it's an interesting question because we're talking a lot about human rights and democracy in the Middle East. The one democracy in the Middle East, Israel, is having trouble functioning as a democracy, but it's fascinating. We in America have become incredibly polarized over the last 10 years. We all either recognize that, regret it, celebrate it, I don't know. We're not here to talk about American politics, but we know how to distinguish between liberals and conservatives in America. We know which policy issues are important to one and the other. We know where our arguments are. We have those arguments with our friends, in our classrooms, obviously within our family units, often between generations. In Israel, you're hard-pressed to find anybody who disagrees with the following number of statements. We have to prevent Iran from gaining a nuclear weapon, even if that means military action. We have to retain the Jordan Valley as our security perimeter to ensure that no Arab country can cross through Jordan and attack us physically. We have to promote a vibrant market economy. We have to find a way to promote pluralism within our society. We have to encourage more integration by Arab Muslims, our 20% of our citizens in our society, and improve their access to goods and services, even though they are fully equal within our society. Nobody in the Israeli political spectrum, or certainly not within that moderate center that we're talking about, which is 70 to 80% of the Israeli electorate, disagree with anything I just said. They would agree fundamentally also with the statement. We have to find a way to make peace with our neighbors, all the Arab world, and most particularly those who self-identify as Palestinians. And 70% of Israelis still support the concept of a Palestinian state, even after 20 years of the violence that Yasser Arafat started in the year 2000 with his second intifada, this literally war against peace that he started after thousands of Israelis were killed or maimed or injured in terror attacks. Still, 70% of Israelis support the idea of a Palestinian state, as long as that state isn't geared and devoted to attacking us and destroying us. So the issue of what divides Israelis, even if you read in the papers a lot, especially during an election year, the issues that divide us pale in comparison to the issues that actually we agree on, which doesn't necessarily mean it's easy to form a government. But mark my words, from what I just read yesterday, I don't have any inside information, I just followed the news relatively carefully,